Summer on the Mount, Sermon on the Mount series. Mark and I have been playing tag in terms of our presence here. Finally, we're both here at the same time, which is great. But I listened to your sermon from last time and really appreciated what you had to say about giving and prayer and fasting, which was our last section, in terms of finding postures of healthy dependence on God. Well, I wonder if the treasure's here.
It's just the wind.
The wind.
It's the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Blowing through.
So yes, today we're talking about treasure, in case that wasn't actually X marks the spot works pretty well with that thing too. But in other words, we're talking about money and stuff that we own. And this is actually the first sermon I've ever preached about money, which is surprising considering there are more verses about money in the Gospels than about heaven and hell combined. Second only to the kingdom of God, it's the thing that Jesus talks the most about. And a third of his parables have to do with money. But when I think about sermons about money, my main associations are thinly veiled tithing campaigns, trying to get people to give to church, or soft-pedaled guilt trips about how it might be good for you to spend a little bit less on yourself and just give a little bit more. Money sermons just so often feel vague and safe and sneakily self-serving. And actually, when I was planning worship, it also reminded me how resistant I feel to songs about surrendering all things to God who's more than enough for us. It just feels too easy to sing them without asking what that really means. Why is it so hard to sing and talk about money in church? I think lots of reasons. I mean, it's not like we're talking about money all the time outside of church either. Money is linked to power and linked to class and brings up the complex dance between choice and privilege. Talking about money also brings up deep anxieties and sometimes shame. Few of us, I think, are 100% certain that we're making the right, ethical, wise financial choices. We worry that people might judge us for what we have or what we don't have and what we do with it. No one wants to be seen as just a walking wallet or as a charity case to be pitied. And it's also hard to talk about money because it's just confusing. At least I find it confusing. In my opinion, economic systems are mystifying in an almost deliberate way. It's like other people are benefiting from my failure to understand them, I think. Still, at Open Way, I think we need to get good at talking about this stuff. Partly because, as you see on the back page, as a church, we actually now have some money. We had a great fundraising campaign that wasn't linked to a sermon, thank God. And together we now have to decide what to do with this money. And we also have some shared practices as members of Open Way, since we center around practices instead of specifically around shared beliefs. And a couple of them pertain to money and to work. So specifically the practice of enough is one of the ones we name, and the practice of Sabbath, which Mark kind of talked about last time too. So let's take a look at what Jesus is saying here. I'm going to invite Shirley to come read the incredibly fine print of the bulletin reading.
Glasses off. All right, the scripture reading is in the bulletin, Matthew 6, verses 19 to 24. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The Gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks, Shirley. So as we've mentioned several times in this series, Jesus' audience on the mountainside was predominantly poor. I was reading this week about how in first century Israel, 85% of the people who lived there were barely making ends meet, just barely subsisting, because the rich minority was clawing back almost 50% of their income in taxes. So as victims of a dysfunctional economy, these poor folks would be nodding along with Jesus here, flipping the bird to the rich treasure hoarders in their community. But I think Jesus' words were warnings for them too, because poverty doesn't give you immunity from slavery to the desire for money. Anybody can have that. So Jesus advises them, don't store up treasures on earth, or as the Greek says, don't treasure up treasures on earth. His reasoning had to do with moths and vermin and thieves. My aunt from North Carolina last week was visiting, and she kept saying varmints. So I almost wanted to say varmints there. That was great. Good word. Obviously, wealth was very organic in that agrarian society. It was held in stores of grain and grapes and olives that were vulnerable to those creatures. Today, of course, we have many digital, moth and vermin-proof ways of storing our capital or income. But we could easily replace moth and vermin with fluctuating markets and layoffs. And theft is definitely still very much a thing, especially identity theft and data breaches. So our treasures on earth are still more vulnerable than we usually care to admit. So Jesus, knowing that the location of our treasure is the location of our heart, our center of gravity, the core of our very being, Jesus advises us to treasure up treasures in heaven, redirecting our desires instead of expecting us to eliminate them altogether. And to be honest, sometimes I wish he just had gone further and said, just stop focusing on storing up treasure at all. I mean, it still seems kind of self-serving and materialistic to want to store up anything for your own use, even if it's in God's kingdom. And there's some debate among theologians about whether, in the life to come, we will have differing amounts of reward or treasure that we can earn by what we do in this life. Biblical passages like this one seem to talk about this, but other passages suggest that the new kingdom will upend all of our expectations about who gets what. Later in Matthew 19, Jesus will talk to that rich, sometimes call him the rich young ruler, the rich guy. He'll say, give to the poor and you'll have treasure in heaven. So storing up treasure in heaven seems to be directly linked to quitting our treasure hoarding here on earth. They're one and the same. And as I was talking about this with Denise just today, she was mentioning that treasure in heaven might be Jesus' way at hinting at a whole new economy for a whole new kind of community, the community of the new kingdom. Treasure in heaven might equate with the relational capital that we're building by redistributing resources. More on that later, but let's just get back to the passage, because was anyone else thrown off by that little section on optometry that was just kind of right in the middle there? Verses 22 and 23 are a little bit strange, but as you know, I absolutely love looking into ancient science. So what I learned this week was that in Jesus' time, people thought that people's eyes actually cast light on things, and that's how you see them, like a lamp, instead of what we know today about eyes letting light into your body. So that's interesting. Hebrew and Greco-Roman culture also made a direct correlation between bodily characteristics and soul characteristics. So the eye was thought to express someone's character, the desires of their heart. A good eye full of light meant a helpful, generous person. And an evil eye full of darkness meant a stingy and envious person. We see the same language in Jesus' upcoming story about the Vineyard Workers in Matthew 20. That's the one where there's people who work all day and they grumble about how the owner is paying them the same as the people who only worked for 1 hour. Does anyone remember that story, reading that? The owner literally says to the grumbling people, "Is your eye evil because I am good?" In other words, are you envious because I am generous? So with this whole optometry section, Jesus is basically rephrasing his first statement, warning against the kind of earthly greed that will darken your soul. Finally, we have this last verse about the two competing masters, God and money. And for that word money, Jesus chooses the term mammon. It's an Aramaic word that originates from something that means what is trusted in, a kind of a personification of treasure, wealth, or possessions. So Jesus says, if you make yourself slave to both mammon and God, you'll hate one and love the other. by which he means when faced with competing demands, you'll make your choice. It's impossible to serve both. It's not a statement of morality or wisdom here, it's just a statement of ability. We all eventually show our true allegiance. I think this whole chunk of the Sermon on the Mount is tough for us to digest in today's world. We have an economic system that's entirely based on stored up treasure, on investments and interest. Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, said so himself. That's the basis. It's a Mammon kind of world. And it's a world where everything, including humans, are quantifiable. We have a net worth. So how are we supposed to know if we're mastering our money or if it's mastering us? I don't think money in and of itself is evil. It's the love of money that says it's evil. Money is a tool. But what I've said before in other teachings is that if it's a tool, I think it's maybe a pickaxe. And it's one that tends to kind of get lodged in us instead of carving a path forward to freedom. I believe it's a tool that can be used by spiritual principalities and powers to kind of work against us in our world. As I was sitting with this passage, though, this week, I got thinking about another Bible story about how storing stuff up can render it useless. And that was the story of the Israelites in the desert, when God fed them with manna. The word manna basically translates, what the heck is this? It's literally the meaning of it, which is maybe what they said when they saw the flaky stuff on the ground every morning. They were instructed to only gather 1 omer per person, so about 3 pounds, enough for 1 day's food. And if they tried to store more of it in jars overnight, it would rot. Except on Friday, before the Sabbath. On Friday, they were instructed to gather double, and it wouldn't go bad overnight. And that way you didn't have to work to gather it on the Sabbath. I think God was doing more than just creatively feeding the people to make for a fun Bible story. God was retraining the Hebrew people in a new economic system in hopes that they wouldn't just default right back into the one that relied on slavery, the one that he had just saved them from. I think God's lessons had to do with our 2 shared practices of Sabbath and enough. Lesson 1, Sabbath. Your worth and your provision comes from God and not your work. The manna on the ground was pure gift, pure blessing. And it's the same for us, I think, with our money and our stuff. We might think that we're earning our money or our stuff, but the fact remains that even if it's deposited into our account, our money is not our money, and our stuff is not our stuff, any more than the manna was Israel's manna, at least from a Jewish way of thinking. Everything belongs to God. God lets us be tenants and caretakers of God's stuff for a while, but in the words of one church father, giving to the poor is just returning what already belongs to them. Or more accurately, what belongs to God, who has say over who needs it the most. We tend to strongly link money to work. I earned it, so I'm entitled to it, and I can decide what to do with it. But I think it's really important for us to kind of decouple these 2 concepts. There's plenty of valuable work that people do that doesn't bring in money. Work like parenting, for example. And then there's tons of hard work that earns very little money, tons of easy work that brings in lots. I mean, what is the rubric that decides what work should earn more money or not? Is it more dangerous work? Is it more strenuous work? Jesus would tell these stories again about owners paying the same amount to the 1-hour workers that they did to the day-long workers. The fact is, I think that work and money are both gifts from God. And God does not link our worth to either of those gifts. God provided enough manna even for the Sabbaths, for the times when he didn't allow the people to work. So that's lesson 1. And I think lesson 2 was enough. In God's gift economy, there is enough to go around. God's world is an economy of abundance, not scarcity. God always sends enough manna, but only if everyone takes only what they need. Which means that contrary to some of the principles of capitalism, there is such a thing as too little as well as too much. God's gifts are meant to circulate, not to concentrate. You need an empty enough jar to let God fill it with manna tomorrow. The people of Israel actually kept a small jar of manna in the Ark of the Covenant once they arrived in the land to honor these important lessons that they learned in the desert. Now, they didn't always live by them, as we see through the history books of the Old Testament, but there's some evidence that in their laws of Jubilee, they tried to do that. The hard question for us is, how do we embody a culture of manna in the midst of a culture of mammon? Very close words. How can we ensure that our heart and our treasure are in the right place? As I was researching for this sermon, I just, for fun, typed Manna and Mammon into Google, and I found this great series of YouTube videos from a ministry called Bartimaeus Collective Ministries called Mammon to Manna. And I spent 3 hours watching these videos. They were videos that acknowledged that some of this work is political, some of it's about changing big picture systems, and we might disagree about how to do that. But some of it is intensely personal, about our own choices and our accounts. So they listed 7 areas we could examine, both on the small scale of our own accounts, but as big as our nations and our world, and ask us to creatively consider how each of us can more closely align with manna economics, with Sabbath, with enough. The areas I actually listed in one of the questions on the back of the bulletin, but just quickly I'm going to list them for you. The first one was surplus, investment, savings. How much do we have? What's it doing while it's sitting there? Is it being used for good, for rebuilding social relationships? And if not, does it need to go somewhere else? Number 2 is debt. How can we reduce it? How can we prevent making decisions based on easy access to credit? 3 is giving. Are we giving away money, time, and talent? How much? To whom? What's our relationship to those to whom we give, and how does it impact our relationship with them? 4 is ecology. What effect do our financial and purchasing decisions have on the global system, on the planet? 5 is consumption. This is a tough one. They talk about addiction in this one. What about our relationship with money and stuff is addictive or compulsive? It's going to be different for different ones of us. 6 is solidarity. How do we meaningfully interact with and advocate for people who have less than we do, for economically marginalized people? And then finally, work and Sabbath. How often do we work? How often do we stop working? How can we break this compulsive, addictive relationship we sometimes have with work? Especially good work, nonprofit work, church work. That's one of the biggest culprits. So we can ask these questions as individuals, as families, as churches, as cities. And I think it's tempting to try to come up with hard and fast rules about these things. We usually assume that the strictest self-denial, the most ascetic path, is the holiest path. But that can sometimes lead us away from holiness into a smug kind of pride. Bill McKibben wrote, "I consume inconvenience, turning it into a pleasurable commodity. It becomes the fuel for my own sense of superiority." Of course, Jesus himself was homeless and depended on other people for food and shelter, but some people called him a glutton and a drunkard, so he must not have been completely ascetic. And he didn't stop Mary from anointing him with expensive perfume. So we can have best practices and best wisdom financially, but in my experience, the alwayses and the nevers tend to silence God's Spirit in the particulars. I think the Spirit will probably take us down different paths in regards to our money and our stuff. But even if our paths look different, it doesn't mean that we have to walk on our own. By opening up to at least a few people that we trust, we can resist the shame and the confusion and uncertainty that often accompanies our usual privacy about finances. We can inspire creativity in each other and find accountability together. Ched Myers, who's part of this Bartimaeus Collective Ministry, says that talking about our money with our friends deprivatizes our anxieties and communitizes our imagination. So I think we need to break some of our silence. And to my chagrin, I remembered something Rachel Held Evans wrote, that the primary job of pastors is to go first in terms of talking about sin and fear and, yes, money. So I want to share my 2-minute story of me and money. When I talk about these things, it's definitely hard to resist making comparisons to each other, and I know that. But no matter how your money and your decisions compare to mine, I hope that what this does is to inspire more conversation about this instead of getting stuck in comparisons. So I grew up in Saskatoon, and growing up, our family of 6 lived on my father's Baptist pastor salary. We lived quite frugally, but I never worried about having too little. I remember there were members of our church who would give us free things from time to time. Our dentist would never let us pay for our teeth cleanings. Another wealthy church member replaced our minivan, which was dying, with a brand new one that had automatic doors that would open on their own. And I remember my mom feeling so uncomfortable with such an extravagant gift, but me and my siblings loved it. Like broke the automatic door by playing with it too much. I got through post-secondary studies almost debt-free, based mostly on privilege, not as much on effort. I lived at home during my bachelor's degree without paying for rent or food. And for both of my degrees, I relied mainly on scholarships, some part-time work, and an interest-free loan from my grandmother to keep the money flowing. I do remember one year at Regent when Denise and I were both kind of hurting for cash, and we offered up our bodies for UBC science experiments. That was a low period. We both survived. It was just MRIs and stuff like that. It was fun. I worked downtown at Jacobswell, downtown Eastside, for a while, and working for a struggling nonprofit meant that at times I was paid in vegetables from the community garden. Still, compared to the people in that neighborhood, I felt wealthy. And I learned a lot about giving and lending in those years, how sometimes it can increase trust and increase relationship, and other times it became like a barrier because people would avoid me when they couldn't pay me back. As renters and as people without children, Denise and I now live on a monthly budget of about $4,500, and we've been trying to save some money, at least $100 or $200 a month. Though with the higher rent in our new place, we've definitely dipped into our savings some lately. Considering those 7 areas actually gave me a bit of a fire to move our savings into places where they can be invested ethically and used for things like microcredit loans and rebuilding communities. So we actually have an appointment with Man City this Wednesday, and we're going to try to do that. Right now, we've been giving away about 5% of what we earn, and I sometimes feel guilty about that being so low. But then again, I'm right now an unpaid pastor, so I know that this work is also a form of giving. When I am stressed, I tend to get stingy with money. I tend to hold on to it. I tend to not want to spend it or give it away. However, I will sometimes compulsively buy concert tickets and used books. Those are my two vices. Maybe not vices, but I feel like I need to jump on the opportunity, and I don't really think all the time about whether it's the best use of my money at that particular time. My number one challenge, though, is workaholism. I'm addicted to workaholic. I've been on a lifelong journey of trying to set boundaries around my work, but even with consistent Sabbaths, I struggle with it on pretty much a daily basis. Just yesterday, my housemate Tim, who some of you know, said, "Beth, you're really busy." And I was like, yeah, you're right. I have trouble saying no, and I have trouble resting. The website globalrichlist.com says my income puts me in the top 1% richest people on earth. But I actually think my networks and my connections make me even richer. With my family, friends, and extended church networks, both in Saskatoon and here, I know people will rally to support me if I ever got sick, or if my work fell through and I couldn't cover rent for a while. And I think that's what real wealth is. That's also what we can offer each other here, as we start to bring God's new future economy into the present. As I close, I just wanted to bring up some fun, creative ideas about finding new ways of relating to money and possessions. And again, I want to remind us that there's no one single right path for this, so don't take this as a checklist or to-do list. These are just ideas to start expanding our communal imagination. So for example, I know people who make a monthly budget and always make a point of sharing it with a good friend so they can offer feedback and accountability on it. I know a couple who stopped using their debit and credit cards and took out their spending money for the month in cash form, keeping it in different jars for different budgeted purposes, and it made it easier for them to resist going over budget. Another idea, this is a risque one, but was a credit card condom. So this is a sleeve that goes over your credit card that encourages safe spending, and that you have to remove before using it, so it's an extra step. Take that if you like. I'm not kidding, that's an actual idea. So if I get new clothes, I need to give away something to free up a hanger, which means less hoarding of clothes, which is good for me. I know someone else who actually puts stickers on items in her house, and those stickers, you know those ones that say this belongs to blank? So she writes God and puts these stickers on all kinds of things as a reminder that her stuff is not hers. And I remember that if someone would tell her, I really like your sweater, she would say, thanks, do you want to have it? And usually they'd clarify that they really like it on her. But she did that to remind herself to be really open-handed with the things that she had. Speaking of stuff, one of my former pastors used to have a practice of postponing purchases, even small things like toasters, and first taking a couple days to pray for God to show up and provide in a different way. And sometimes she would see that prayer answered in really weird ways, or the delay would make her realize that maybe she didn't need it as much as she thought in that initial moment. I know someone else who has a practice of giving something away every time he has a bad day, even if it's something tiny. It just makes him feel better. My most recent experiment has been joining my neighborhood's Buy Nothing Facebook groups. Anyone else part of a Buy Nothing group? I think most neighborhoods have them on Facebook. It's a great example of leveraging technology for social good. So the idea is your neighbors will post photos of things that they no longer need and give them for free. It has to be free, no trades, to people in the neighborhood who say that they could use them. Although my wife might say this has caused me to accumulate some things that I don't really need. I need to watch that for myself. And then there's sometimes happy accidents that end up being good reminders, like this morning when I walked to a coffee shop to finish this sermon about money and realized I forgot my wallet. Got me thinking about money. I would love to keep chatting about ideas like this, maybe over dinner if you come out with us afterwards. Maybe you have other things that you've seen or friends of yours have done. I think we can help each other to keep kind of dislodging this pickaxe of money. And maybe as we build trust together in open ways, some of us can even start to practice Sabbath and enough in more extravagant ways, sharing resources to do amazing things in our city that will make people take notice and ask what's going on there, kind of like they did with the early church. Maybe a jam collective. I got some free jam this morning today that was amazing. So we'll see. And I know it won't be easy. This stuff challenges us to the core. And Mark will be preaching next time about overcoming the anxieties that come with being this open-handed. The good news is that there's treasure waiting for us in this. And at least some of the treasure is feeling freed from silence toward mutual vulnerability, freed from tight-fisted worry toward open-handed joy, freed from competition toward deeper partnerships, freed from an economy of stingy scarcity to a gift economy of abundance. And we might just get some tastes, some appetizers of a new way of being human together, flowing from heaven, from the future into the present. A new economy, treasured up in relationships rebuilt, where we watch everyone around us flourish. That's the dream, if we can work for it together with God. Amen.